Greetings, history lover fellows. Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution podcast series, which we examine and unfold critical turning points that forged new paths in human history in chronological order. It's really great to have you with us again.
Yeah, it's great to be back. We have a really massive topic today.
We really do. And, when we usually look at a map of the world, or even just like a map of a city, there's this built-in expectation of clarity.
Right, like everything is settled.
Exactly. You see the borders, you see the rivers, the neat little lines dividing neighborhoods. It's all very static, You point at a country and say, there it is.
Yeah, but that map doesn't tell you the whole story.
No, not at all. Because if you want to understand why an earthquake happens, for instance, looking at that paper map is completely useless.
Right, it won't help you at all.
You have to look beneath the surface. You have to look at the tectonic plates, massive unseen forces just grinding against each other in the dark.
And suddenly the landscape isn't just static geography anymore.
Exactly. It's the result of this deep structural friction. And that tectonic friction is exactly what we are exploring in our deep dive today.
Which is a really intense way to look at history, actually. That underlying friction is the absolute definition of looking past the symptoms to find the mechanical root cause of a phenomenon.
And to find that root cause, we are unpacking a stack of articles from a publication called In Defense of Marxism.
Okay, so a very specific perspective.
Very specific. These sources analyze the historical and ongoing Black civil rights struggle, but they do it through a very strict, unapologetic Marxist lens.
Right.
So just to set the parameters right out of the gate for you listening, we are exploring a deeply left-wing anti-capitalist perspective today.
And we should be clear, our goal here is not to endorse these views.
No, definitely not. We certainly are taking sides. Our mission is to impartially report on and decode how these specific authors connect racial oppression directly to the economic machinery of capitalism.
We basically want to understand the architecture of their argument.
Exactly. And to do that, we need to start with the bedrock.
Yeah, the foundational concept the authors build upon is class struggle.
Right, which is a term people hear a lot but maybe don't fully grasp.
Totally. In Marxist theory, the engine of all human history isn't just a series of random events. And it isn't driven merely by the ideas of great individuals either.
So it's not just like kings and presidents making decisions.
No, not at all. It is driven by the conflict between different economic classes.
Okay.
The texts we are looking at focus on the capitalist era, right?
Yeah.
Where that primary conflict is between the working class, the people who have to sell their labor to survive, and the bourgeoisie.
And the bourgeoisie being the owner.
Exactly. The owners of capital, the factories, the corporations, the land.
So basically the people doing the work versus the people owning the places where the work is done.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the Marxist perspective argues that the owners of capital are fundamentally driven by the need to maximize profit.
Which makes sense in a capitalist system.
Right, but to maximize profit, that inherently requires minimizing what they give to the workers in wages and benefits.
Oh, I see. So it's a zero-sum game.
Essentially, yes.
Oh.
This creates a perpetual, irreconcilable antagonism. And everything else in society, politics, culture, the legal system, and as our sources argue today, racism grows out of that foundational economic conflict.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the central thesis running through every single article in our stack today is incredibly provocative.
It really is.
The authors firmly argue that racism is not merely a matter of individual prejudice. It's not just people having bad ideas or, generational ignorance or hateful hearts.
Right. They see it as much bigger than that.
They argue that racism is a structural component manufactured and actively maintained by capitalism itself.
And the sources spend a lot of time detailing the actual mechanics of how this works. The primary mechanism they identify is divide and rule.
Divide and rule.
Yeah. The texts argue that the ruling class actively weaponizes racial lines to fracture the working class.
How?
Well, to ground this, the authors pull a quote from Bobby Seale.
The founding member of the Black Panther Party.
Exactly. Seale wrote that racism and ethnic differences allow the power structure to exploit the masses, because that division is the key by which they maintain their control.
Right.
The objective is literally to divide the people and conquer them. The articles then pair this with a very blunt, famous statement from Malcolm X.
What's the statement?
He said, "You cannot have capitalism without racism."
Wow. Okay, let's really look at the mechanics of that. If we are treating this like a machine, Why does the ruling class press the racism button? What is the economic output of that division?
Well, in this theoretical framework, a unified working class holds immense, basically unstoppable power.
Because there are so many more of them.
Right. If workers across all demographics realize they share the exact same economic interests, they can demand higher wages, better conditions, or, as Marxists ultimately advocate, overthrow the entire economic system.
So unity is an existential threat to the owners.
Exactly. The texts argue that if the capitalist class can convince the white worker that the black worker is their primary enemy, if they have them fighting each other over shrinking slices of the pie, the workers are entirely distracted.
I see. They are pointing fingers horizontally at each other.
Yes, rather than pointing them vertically at the people hoarding the wealth.
It sounds a bit like a rigged casino.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like the house wants the players at the poker table getting furious at each other for bluffing. Because as long as the players are fighting over the chips on the felt, no one is looking up to realize the house is taking a massive cut of every single pot.
That is exactly it. And the texts scale that exact casino dynamic up to a civilizational level. The authors argue that the bourgeoisie would like nothing better than for workers to organize their grievances based on skin color.
Rather than uniting against their common economic exploiter.
Right. And the texts draw a direct line back to the origins of the transatlantic slave trade to illustrate this.
Okay, let's go back there.
They argue that the concept of race, as we understand it today, didn't just naturally exist. It was specifically codified into law in the 17th century to justify the brutal extraction of free agricultural labor.
So it was an economic tool from the very beginning.
Yes. They needed a massive labor force for the plantations, and they needed a permanent, unchangeable justification to keep that labor force enslaved.
So they view the economic base as the root of the poisonous tree, and individual racism as the fruit.
That's a great way to summarize it.
But hold on. By reducing centuries of complex, deeply entrenched racial animosity to a mere tool of the bourgeoisie, don't these sources risk oversimplifying the visceral prejudice that people face daily?
That is a very common critique.
Because, it feels like it flattens the lived experience of racism into a sterile economics equation. If we accept that the capitalist class wants to divide workers, doesn't that make the actual people holding the discriminatory signs or committing the hate crimes seem like passive puppets?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. The counter-argument embedded in the sources is that they aren't denying the psychological reality of prejudice, nor are they denying the autonomy of the individuals perpetuating it.
Okay, so they acknowledge the hate is real.
Oh, absolutely. They aren't saying the hatred isn't real or terrifying to the people suffering from it. What they're analyzing is the sustenance of that hatred over centuries.
Why it keeps surviving.
Right. Why does it persist? Their argument is that psychological prejudice was seeded by material imperatives, and it continues to be nurtured because it remains economically useful.
So it's profitable to keep people divided.
Exactly. The text suggests that if you only fight the psychology of racism, if you just try to change hearts and minds through education or sensitivity training, you will always fail.
Because the underlying machine is still running.
Because the economic system is actively regenerating that division to protect its profit margins.
That makes sense within their framework.
Right.
So if this divide and rule tactic is the foundation, how long have these theorists been applying it to America? Because looking at our stack of sources, this isn't just a modern 21st century retrospective.
Oh, far from it. The publication In Defense of Marxism includes archival texts to show the lineage of this thought. One of the most fascinating pieces in the stack is an article from July 1920.
1920. That's over a century ago.
Written by an American journalist and communist named John Reed.
Okay.
The piece is titled America and the Negro Question. And to give you the historical context for you listening, Reed is writing right on the heels of the 1917 Russian Revolution.
Right.
And immediately following the Red Summer of 1919 in the United States, which saw horrific white supremacist violence and race riots across dozens of American cities.
It was a brutal time.
It was. Returning black veterans from World War I were being lynched, and there was a massive militant awakening happening within the black community.
So this is a period of immense global and domestic upheaval.
Absolutely. A total powder keg. And within that, Reed makes a very specific strategic argument to his fellow leftists. He states that communists must not stand aloof from the black movement demanding social and political equality.
Okay.
He observes this rapid growth of racial consciousness and argues that socialists must be entirely integrated into it.
But the sources emphasize a very particular phrasing Reed uses. I have it here. He writes that this civil rights movement must be used to, and this is a direct quote, expose the lie of bourgeois equality.
Yes. The concept of bourgeois equality is vital to decoding this entire deep dive.
Let's break that down for someone who might be hearing it for the first time.
In the simplest terms, bourgeois equality means equality strictly on paper.
On a paper.
Right. It is legal equality within a capitalist state. It's the idea that the Constitution or the law says everyone is equal, everyone has the right to vote, everyone has the right to own a business, everyone has the right to seek employment.
It makes me think of playing a game of Monopoly.
Okay, how so?
Well, bourgeois equality is the rule book that says both you and I get to roll the exact same dice, and we both get to move around the exact same board. The rules apply equally to us.
Right.
But the material reality is that I am joining the game 3 hours late, and you already own Boardwalk, Park Place, and all the railroads. The fact that I am legally allowed to roll the dice doesn't change the fact that I am mathematically guaranteed to go bankrupt just by participating in the system.
That captures the Marxist critique perfectly.
Yeah.
The authors argued that legal equality is an illusion if the material reality is vastly unequal.
Because the starting line is in two totally different places.
Exactly. The texts point out that giving a marginalized group legal rights while keeping them economically subjugated as a super-exploited underclass with no inherited wealth and no control over production is essentially a lie.
Right.
The law might say a billionaire and an impoverished worker are equally forbidden from sleeping on a park bench, but only one of them is ever going to be arrested for it.
Because what good is the legal right to eat at an integrated lunch counter if the economic system ensures you can never afford to buy the burger?
Precisely. And the sources use Reed to argue that true liberation cannot come from just tinkering with the laws or winning court cases within a capitalist framework.
It has to go deeper.
It requires a total social revolution that changes who owns the wealth. Reed was essentially predicting the limitations of the future civil rights era decades before it even happened.
But let's look closely at Reed's language here. He says communists should use this movement to expose the capitalist system.
Yeah, that word choice stands out.
It really does. Doesn't that utilitarian tone suggest that the specific, unique trauma of racial oppression is secondary? Does the fight for Black lives become just a convenient vehicle or, a stepping stone for the broader socialist agenda?
It definitely can read that way.
Because if you are an activist fighting for your community's daily survival, hearing a theorist say they want to use your struggle to prove a point about economics has to sound incredibly dismissive.
The texts anticipate this tension, which has historically been a massive friction point between nationalist civil rights movements and socialist movements.
How do they defend it?
The authors of these articles would counter that it's not about hijacking one struggle to serve another. It's about realizing that they are, at their core, the exact same struggle.
Two sides of the same coin.
Right. In their framework, there is simply no viable path to Black liberation without a socialist revolution. So fighting for one inherently means fighting for the other. They view the overthrow of capitalism as the prerequisite for ending racism.
Okay, I see.
However, the critique of that vocabulary is totally valid. The word use carries an instrumentalist baggage that can alienate the very people experiencing the immediate daily violence of racism, making the theory feel, disconnected from the reality on the ground.
By the way, if you liked and interested in the topics in the video so far, please don't forget to like, share, and comment. Also, we'd be appreciated if you subscribe to the channel to be informed about new episodes. It's also really important for us to continue this series.
Definitely. And moving forward, if true liberation, according to this 1920 text, requires looking past legal reforms and demanding a total economic restructuring.
Right. What happens when mainstream civil rights leaders start actually realizing that and moving in that direction?
Exactly, because that's exactly what the sources argue happened 40 years later during the explosive era of the 1960s.
Let's get into that. The articles dedicate significant space to analyzing the lives, the ideological evolution, and ultimately the assassinations of two of history's most prominent civil rights leaders.
Malcolm X, who was killed in February 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, and Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated in April 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee.
The sources focus very heavily on the specific circumstances of MLK's presence in Memphis on the day he was murdered.
They do. Mainstream history often paints a vague picture that he was just there on a general civil rights tour.
Like it was just another stop.
Right. But the texts emphasize that he was there specifically to lead a rally supporting 1,300 local refuse collectors. It was a massive sanitation workers' strike.
The details of that strike are crucial to the Marxist analysis, aren't they?
Very much so. These workers, who were almost entirely black, were working in horrific conditions for poverty wages.
It was a very dangerous job.
The strike was actually triggered when two sanitation workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death in the back of a malfunctioning garbage truck.
God, that's awful.
Because they were forced to take shelter in there from the pouring rain. The city refused to recognize their union and refused to improve conditions.
Yeah, that's when they marched with those famous signs.
Yes, the signs that simply read, "I am a man." King saw this as the perfect intersection of racial dignity and working class struggle.
And what about Malcolm X? The texts argue he was undergoing a similar realization.
They do. The authors track Malcolm X's trajectory after his departure from the Nation of Islam. He traveled extensively across Africa and the Middle East, meeting with leaders of anti-colonial movements.
He was broadening his perspective.
Exactly. The sources highlight that he was increasingly speaking out against global imperialism and began explicitly connecting the struggles of Black Americans to the struggles of oppressed working classes worldwide.
So he was moving away from strict racial separatism.
Yes, and moving toward an anti-capitalist, internationalist perspective.
Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments so we can see and try to answer.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this evolution, because the texts posit that this specific evolution, this realization by both men that race and class were deeply intertwined, made them an existential threat to the capitalist establishment.
Because as long as they just talked about racial segregation, they could be managed.
Or marginalized or appeased with legal reforms. But the moment King started organizing the Poor People's Campaign, trying to unite poor Black, white, Hispanic, and Indigenous Americans into a massive class-based movement, the establishment panicked.
The articles actually argued that the powers that be had a concrete material interest in removing both men from the political scene.
Right. The text suggests that their shift toward class consciousness was the final straw.
Going back to that divide and rule strategy.
Exactly. A charismatic leader uniting the fractured working class is the ultimate nightmare scenario for the divide and rule strategy we discussed earlier.
So they couldn't be allowed to succeed.
Therefore, the sources conclude they had to be eliminated to protect the economic order.
It is a striking departure from how history is often sanitized in textbooks. We usually remember MLK purely for the "I have a dream" speech, for peaceful integration.
Right, the very safe, non-threatening version.
The fact that he was actively organizing a multi-racial working-class uprising against poverty when he was shot is almost entirely omitted from the standard curriculum. It's like the economic teeth of his message were carefully extracted after his death.
And the sources present this as a classic example of how radical figures are posthumously pacified by the very systems they opposed.
Turning revolutionaries into harmless icons.
Exactly, to prevent future generations from adopting their more dangerous structural critiques.
But let's scrutinize the claim about their assassinations for a moment.
Sure.
While the sources make a compelling case about the establishment's material interest in silencing their anti-capitalist turn, doesn't framing their deaths primarily around their socialist evolution risk downplaying the sheer, brutal force of white supremacist terrorism?
It's a tricky balance.
Because these men were receiving daily death threats and having their homes bombed by intense, violent racists long before they started reading anti-imperialist theory or organizing labor strikes.
That's true. The racial hatred was always there.
Does the Marxist lens accidentally erase the raw, visceral hatred of their actual killers by focusing entirely on the economic beneficiaries?
The sources approach this by separating the instrument from the motive. They do not deny the virulent racism of the individuals who pulled the triggers or plotted the logistics.
Okay, so they aren't ignoring the hitmen, so to speak.
No, but Marxist historical analysis always looks for the structural beneficiary. They ask, who benefits most when the trigger is pulled?
Follow the money.
Always. The authors argue that while white supremacist terrorism was the weapon, the defense of capitalism was the deeper systemic motive that allowed that terrorism to succeed, or at least turned a blind eye to it until the threat was neutralized.
So you are looking at the bullet, but the Marxist texts are analyzing the entire socioeconomic complex that manufactured the gun and provided the target.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it. But your critique is essential. You listening must weigh whether this macro-level economic analysis sufficiently respects the immediate, terrifying reality of racial violence that defined these leaders' daily lives.
It's a lot to consider. But when those leaders are eliminated, the movement doesn't just stop. It fractures, it gets more militant, and then, crucially, it morphs.
It finds new channels.
The void left by King and Malcolm X paved the way for profound shifts, which the sources track from the late 60s into the 2000s.
The articles begin this next phase by analyzing the legacy of the Black Panther Party.
And given the Marxist framework we've established, it is obvious why the authors focus heavily on the Panthers.
Very obvious. The Black Panther Party was explicitly attempting to combine the fight against racial discrimination with a united working-class struggle for socialism.
Right. They weren't just about armed self-defense, which is what the media often focused on.
They were reading Marx and Mao. They were creating free breakfast programs for children, setting up free medical clinics in their communities.
In the eyes of our sources, this is essentially localized, community-based wealth redistribution.
Yes. And the texts specifically highlight figures like Fred Hampton, who successfully created the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago.
Tell us about the Rainbow Coalition.
Hampton achieved exactly what the texts say terrifies the ruling class. He formed an alliance between the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican organization, and the Young Patriots.
Who were the Young Patriots?
They were an organization of poor, working-class, white Southerners.
Wow, so a true cross-racial alliance.
Exactly. He united the fractured working class across racial lines based on shared economic oppression. The sources point to his subsequent assassination by law enforcement as further proof of the state violently suppressing any emergence of class unity.
But the state suppression of the Panthers is where the deep dive takes a really fascinating turn, I think.
How so?
The sources argue that you can destroy an organization, but you can't destroy the underlying pressure. If the political avenues are closed off, the ideological struggle just finds a new frequency. It morphs into culture.
Yes, the texts shift their focus to the emergence of hip-hop as a transmitter of revolutionary ideas.
They specifically analyze a 2005 interview conducted in Belgrade with the legendary American hip-hop group Public Enemy.
The article highlights Public Enemy's lyrics and their radically anti-establishment mood, which resonated not just in America, but globally.
There's a specific quote from the interview that the author focuses on. They said, "We don't care what color the oppressor is, it is the oppression that connects us for real."
And the authors view that, quote, as a perfect distillation of class consciousness triumphing over purely racial lines.
It's a very Marxist sentiment.
It really is. What the sources are arguing here is that radical culture, and specifically music like Public Enemy's, served as a vital bridge.
A bridge for the ideology.
Exactly. When political leaders are assassinated and organizations like the Panthers are dismantled, the music maintains and broadcasts the anti-oppressor, anti-capitalist mood.
It reaches millions of young people who might never pick up a dense book on Marxist economic theory.
Right, keeping the embers of revolution glowing.
It reminds me of the trajectory of punk rock in the UK during the 1970s.
Yeah, that's a good parallel.
It started as this raw, visceral rebellion against the rigid class system, the monarchy, and the economic dead end facing working class youth. It was deeply dangerous and political.
Very anti-establishment.
But wait, if we follow that punk rock analogy to its conclusion, eventually those spiked collars, combat boots, and anarchy symbols got mass-produced and sold in high-end shopping malls.
The aesthetic was commodified.
Exactly. And the same thing happened to hip-hop. If a group like Public Enemy is broadcasting this radical anti-capitalist message, but they are doing it through CDs, merchandise, and global tours that are entirely financed, distributed, and owned by massive, multi-billion-dollar corporate record labels. Isn't that a massive contradiction?
It seems like a paradox, yeah.
Doesn't capitalism just eat its own critique?
Yeah.
How do these Marxist sources account for the fact that the revolutionary mood was monetized by the very system it was trying to destroy?
The Marxist theorists, including the authors of these articles, are highly attuned to this dynamic. The academic term they use for this is recuperation.
Recuperation.
Yes. The capitalist system is incredibly resilient and adaptable. It can absorb rebellion, package it, slap a price tag on it, and sell it back to the oppressed as a consumer good.
That's incredibly cynical, but it makes sense.
The sources concede that the form of the rebellion was successfully commercialized by the record labels. However, they argue that the core message, the awakening of class consciousness in the listener, still holds revolutionary potential.
So the music is the alarm clock.
The music is the alarm clock, yes. But the authors emphasize that culture alone is never sufficient.
You actually get out of debt.
Exactly. Listening to Public Enemy might wake you up to the reality of the system, but simply buying the album doesn't change the system. Only organized mass political action can do that.
Right.
And because the underlying capitalist system wasn't overthrown during the cultural waves of the 80s and 90s, the exact same racial and economic oppressions inevitably boiled over again in the 21st century.
Which brings us to a massive focal point in the sources: the search for a political savior within the system. Segment 5 of our deep dive takes us into what the texts call modern illusions.
The sources take a remarkably hard look at the presidency of Barack Obama.
They really do. The stack includes a 2009 article written right as Obama was taking office amidst immense global optimism.
But the authors argued immediately that Obama could not and would not end the scourge of racism.
Why not?
Because, as the head of the American state, his primary function was to manage and maintain capitalism.
This goes right back to the monopoly board analogy from earlier and the concept of bourgeois equality.
Exactly. The texts assert that representation electing the first black president is ultimately a bourgeois illusion if the economic engine of the country remains fundamentally capitalist.
Having a black man manage the capitalist state apparatus doesn't change the exploitative nature of the apparatus itself. It just changes the face of the manager.
That is precisely their argument. The authors argue that the events that unfolded during Obama's presidency serve as the ultimate proof of this failure of representation.
What events are they pointing to?
They point to the 2014 murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri as a critical breaking point. To explain why Ferguson exploded the way it did, despite having a black president and a black attorney general at the time, the text introduces a deeply philosophical Marxist concept.
Okay, lay it on us.
They say the uprising was necessity expressing itself through accident.
Let's spend some time unpacking that, because necessity expressing itself through accident is a dense, almost intimidating phrase. How does that actually work in the real world?
It draws on the philosophy of Hegel, which Marx adapted.
Oh.
Think of it like the tectonic plates you mentioned at the very beginning of the show.
Okay, the deep friction.
Right. The necessity is the immense, unbearable pressure building up underground. In society, that pressure is systemic racism, chronic poverty, underfunded schools, and constant police harassment.
So it's the environment itself.
Because the capitalist system requires an exploited underclass, that pressure is a constant structural necessity. It cannot be alleviated without changing the system.
So the earthquake is inevitable. The necessity is that the ground must eventually shake.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But the accident is the specific event that triggers the quake.
Ah, I see.
The underlying pressure is necessary, but the spark could be anything. In Ferguson, the tragic accident was the specific altercation that led to the killing of Mike Brown.
So they're saying it was just a matter of time.
The texts argue that if it hadn't been Mike Brown on that specific day, it would have been someone else, somewhere else, shortly after. The uprising wasn't just about one isolated tragedy. The tragedy was simply the accidental spark that ignited the necessary powder keg capitalism had built.
The sources carry this exact same mechanical analysis through to the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd.
They do. They highlight the massive international solidarity demonstrations, noting protests across Europe, Canada, and the Americas.
And the texts view the recurring nature of police violence, citing the chilling statistic that a black person is killed nearly twice a week by white police officers in the U.S., not as a failure or a glitch in the system, but as the system working exactly as designed.
Yes. The Marxist perspective views the police not as a flawed institution needing reform, but as the armed wing of the state, existing explicitly to protect private capital and enforce the systemic inequality required by the bourgeoisie.
And the international scope of the protests was significant to them too, right?
Very. The international aspect of the 2020 protests is crucial for the authors. They note that organizations like the International Marxist Tendency participated in these global demonstrations.
Viewing the worldwide response as evidence that the working class internationally is beginning to recognize the shared global nature of capitalist oppression.
Exactly.
Let me pause here, though, because this where the Marxist framework demands a very high level of skepticism regarding conventional progress.
It demands a total reevaluation, really.
For millions of people across the globe, the election of the first black president, the passing of civil rights legislation, the growth of the black middle class, these are undeniably massive, tangible milestones in racial progress.
They absolutely had profound psychological, cultural, and historical significance.
Right. So by strictly demanding an end to capitalism and labeling anything short of that a bourgeois illusion, do these authors unfairly dismiss historical social progress? Is it truly accurate to say nothing fundamental has changed just because a total socialist revolution hasn't occurred?
You have just articulated the fundamental dividing line between reformist politics and revolutionary politics.
How do they differ in practice?
Well, a reformist looks at the timeline and says, look at the progress. The end of chattel slavery, the dismantling of Jim Crow, the integration of schools, a black president. The system is deeply flawed, but it is demonstrably capable of improving.
Which is how most mainstream history is taught.
Right. But the Marxist authors we are studying look at the exact same timeline and see a completely different pattern. They say, look at the mass incarceration system, the enduring racial wealth gap, the gentrification of neighborhoods, the constant police killings.
They focus on the continuity of the oppression.
Exactly. They argue that the concessions of the 20th century were only granted by the ruling class to prevent a full-blown revolution. They don't deny that the Civil Rights Act made life materially better than it was under slavery, but they argue that as long as capitalism remains intact, those gains are fragile.
Fragile and reversible.
Yes, and ultimately insufficient because they do not solve the root issue, economic exploitation.
They refuse to celebrate patching a leak in the roof when the entire foundation of the house is actively rotting away.
That is their stance. And the final piece of evidence the sources present to prove that the foundation is rotten brings the argument out of the realm of police violence and into the realm of global public health.
Right. They argue that the ultimate proof of the system's failure was laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic.
This is a fascinating pivot in the texts. The stack includes a 2020 article from Britain focusing on how the pandemic disproportionately affected what they call BAME communities, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities.
And the authors firmly place the blame for these disproportionate death rates not on biology or genetics, but on the social conditions created by capitalism.
In this Marxist analysis, the pandemic acted as the ultimate, inescapable societal stress test.
When a crisis of that magnitude hits, it ruthlessly exposes the pre-existing fault lines.
Exactly. The authors argue that your risk of contracting and dying from COVID-19 was largely dictated by your class position.
Like, who had the luxury and the broadband access to work safely from home on a laptop?
Yes. Conversely, who was forced onto the front lines, deemed essential, but treated as disposable? The delivery drivers, the grocery clerks, the hospital cleaners.
Who lives in multi-generational, high-density housing because stagnant wages make it impossible to afford rent.
And because capitalism has historically pushed minority populations into those lower economic strata, going all the way back to the divide and rule strategy we discussed in segment 1, those class vulnerabilities instantly become racial vulnerabilities.
The virus itself does not discriminate based on race, but the economy absolutely does.
Therefore, the sources conclude that the stark racial disparity in COVID-19 deaths is the physical, undeniable proof that capitalism is inherently racist in its outcomes. The structure guarantees that the most marginalized will suffer the brunt of any crisis.
It's like a hurricane.
Okay, let's hear the analogy.
The storm itself, the wind and the rain, is a neutral act of nature. It doesn't care who you are or how much money you make.
Right.
But which levees break? Which neighborhoods flood because of poor drainage, and who have the financial resources to evacuate to a hotel 3 states away? That is entirely about economics and infrastructure. The disaster isn't just natural. The casualty rate is engineered by how we choose to build our society.
The virus is the hurricane. Capitalism built the faulty levees. That perfectly encapsulates the text's conclusion.
But we have to ask the critical question to the authors. To what extent is this massive failure uniquely tied to capitalism, as the sources claim, versus a broader failure of state bureaucracy, public health policy, or simple government incompetence that could theoretically occur under any economic model?
That's a fair challenge.
Because if we look at historical examples of state socialist governments, they've also bungled environmental and public health crises catastrophically. Could a hypothetical socialist state have equally botched the pandemic response and seen similar disparities if unconscious prejudices still lingered in the medical bureaucracy?
This is a debate that historians and political scientists will engage in for decades. The authors of In Defense of Marxism would counter your point by arguing that a genuinely socialist society, having entirely eliminated the profit motive, would prioritize human life over keeping the economy open.
Because there's no stock market to protect.
Right. They would argue that without the need to force workers into unsafe factories or meatpacking plants to maintain corporate quarterly profits, the exposure disparities would largely disappear.
But critics would disagree.
Yeah, critics of this strict Marxist view would argue exactly what you just suggested, that large-scale state bureaucracy, human error, and logistical failures can create catastrophic public health outcomes, regardless of whether the state claims to be capitalist or socialist.
We have covered an immense amount of theoretical and historical ground today, tracing a very specific intellectual line from the Russian Revolution and John Reed in the 1920s, through the assassinations of the 1960s, the cultural shifts of hip-hop, all the way to the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's a vast timeline.
It really is. To summarize the core takeaway from our stack of sources from In Defense of Marxism, in their view, you simply cannot decouple race from class.
Right.
The fight for civil rights and the fight for socialism are deeply, inextricably linked because racism is the primary tool used to maintain capitalist exploitation. You cannot pull up the weed without ripping out the root.
And as we stated at the very beginning of this deep dive, our goal was to map out the architecture of this specific intellectual framework. It is entirely up to you, the listener, to evaluate the validity, the strengths, and the blind spots of these arguments.
Exactly. We're just looking at the map.
But understanding this perspective matters deeply. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, recognizing how different ideologies interpret the mechanical roots of societal issues like racism helps us decode the modern political landscape.
It explains the language, the demands, and the underlying logic of the various movements pushing for change on our streets today. We spent this entire time looking beneath the surface map, examining those tectonic plates of class and economy to see how these authors believe they generate the earthquakes of racial injustice. But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It builds on everything we've discussed today, but asks something much deeper about human nature.
What is the thought?
If we were to hypothetically wake up tomorrow in the exact post-capitalist world, these Marxist authors advocate for a world where wealth is entirely redistributed, economic classes are permanently abolished, and the profit motive is completely gone, would human tribalism and racial prejudice truly vanish? Or is the fear of the other, the instinct to divide ourselves into us versus them, a deeper psychological flaw, an evolutionary hangover that outlasts whatever economic systems we build? If you fix the tectonic plates, does the earth still shake?
That challenges the ultimate limits of economic determinism. It is a profound question to leave on.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and here's the solid place to finish the episode. Thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, share, and comment. You can check the link in the description to listen to the full History of Revolution podcast playlist. We're grateful you're here. Take care. Until next time.